Welcome to the program. One of the hardest topics to talk about on this program, because of the charged nature of it, is not politics. In fact, it's religion. And it's important that we talk about religious trends to the degree that we can in an objective way, because it underlines so much of the motivation behind people's lives and what they do and why they do it, and the faith that they carry, which can drive them to do extraordinary things and, sadly, in some cases, drive them to do tragic things. So we can't cover this topic globally in the way we might want, because there just isn't really a lot of research out there or researchers out there who study religious trends at a truly global level across all religions and all backgrounds. There are some demographers who do good work on this, and we've actually talked with some of them on this program. But if we just want to zone in on religious activity, religious communities, religious motivations, that is a little bit trickier. So I challenged my team, and specifically my producer, to see if we could find somebody who can come on to this program and have an objective conversation, but also to have a personal conversation about Christianity in the United States and Western Europe and around the world, the experience of church attendance within that religion, and what we can extrapolate from that into the larger communities, those that are not of the Christian denomination. So Jake Meador is joining us today, and he's joining us from a coffee shop in Lincoln, Nebraska. So there's a little bit of background noise in this. We were able to trim out much of it. A little bit of background traffic as well. So bear with us on the audio. I think it's well worth it to stick with us through the entire recording. And again, we cleaned up some of this. But like any good podcast, sometimes you catch people where they are and when they have time for you. And in Jake's case, that was at a coffee shop in Lincoln, Nebraska. So hopefully the background noise sort of gives you that ambiance of just overhearing a conversation among friends. But he is the editor-in-chief of Mere Orthodoxy and the author of 2 books and several articles specifically on Christianity in the United States. He has spent a good portion of his life studying the trends of church attendance, including the recent decline in attendance across the United States, and the importance of Christian role models in inspiring a new community of leaders throughout the country, here in the U.S. and around the world. So we spent about 45 minutes or so, just talking about his experiences, looking at the research, what it's telling us about people's participation in church, what they think of as church in 2024, how that's different maybe from how our parents and grandparents celebrated Christianity as they actively involved themselves in the community. We also spent some time just talking about what it means and what it tells us about our society. We have a digital era. So many more things are now done through a computer screen that used to be done in person. Does that translate to our religious expression? What is the role of the church in 2024? What are some of the factors that drive people who used to be church-going and were active participants in their religious community to suddenly disappear from it? Or why is it that when people relocate to other parts of the country, they don't take those religious traditions and habits with them? So we did our best in this to have an objective and introspective and thoughtful conversation around this topic. I hope you find it as interesting as we did. And again, bear with us on a little bit of the background audio, but I think you'll be well rewarded if you stick with us through to the end of the program. And then stick with me at the end of the interview. I'm going to come back with a very brief thought on this and some of the questions that I still have that I will look forward to exploring on this podcast in episodes to come. But in the meantime, I invite you to stick with us for my conversation with Jake Meador from Lincoln, Nebraska. Jake, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on. It's good to be here.
All right, I've given a little bit of an introduction about your background, but there's nobody that can talk about themselves like themselves. So please give us a quick introduction to your background and what brought you to this field of study.
So I live in my hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska. It's kind of middle America between Kansas and South Dakota, for the international listeners. I grew up in a kind of fundamentalist church, and by fundamentalist, I don't mean like more conservative than I am now. I mean really was highly schismatic. Kind of thought it was the only good church in town, one of the only good churches, period. That kind of world. Although home life was more comfortable, and I think home life being healthier is probably a large part of why I didn't just kind of bail on Christianity altogether. I went to the University of Nebraska right here in town, and yeah, kind of came back to faith a little bit in college through a healthy church. I worked in journalism, student journalism on campus for all 4 years of college, and I've been writing ever since. And through a variety of things, I've kind of been able to scrape by a living doing it, for which I'm really grateful. So that's a quick overview on the professional side. Personally, I've been married for 13 years. We have 4 kids. Oldest is 11, youngest is 4.
Let's talk a little bit about the topic of church attendance as a proxy for, religious activity, and we'll focus in on the United States for now. But again, we can take this global if you want. The trends that we hear in the news basically are that we have people who are less inclined to be part of organized religion, and that's showing up in various ways, including lack of church participation. We hear that the young people are less interested in joining faith communities, and yet we still know that we have a healthy, robust church community throughout the United States, of all faiths, really, but including Christianity, which continues to be the largest denomination in the U.S. So I'm interested in your perspective on this. We hear what the media is telling us, the mainstream media. We hear what we hear anecdotally from friends and family. But objectively, what are you seeing about participation rates, and what are you hearing and seeing about the next generation and how they're looking at religion and their participation in it?
Yes. So it would have been last year a book came out called The Great Dechurching by a couple friends of mine, Mike Graham and Jim Davis. And what kind of started that book for them, they're both in Orlando, they're both pastors, and they'd lived in Orlando for a long time, I think in Jim's case, his whole life. And they remembered in the 90s when Orlando was a deeply Christian city, in many ways was kind of, though it's further south than what we typically think of as the Bible Belt in America, still felt very like a Bible Belt town. And then by the time they were kind of maturing in their careers and in their ministry work in the early 2010s, they were looking around and realizing, wow, church attendance rates in Orlando are about the same as New York City. What happened? And so they worked with a sociologist named Ryan Burge and commissioned the largest study that's ever been done, to their knowledge. And I haven't come across anything bigger on what they call dechurching behavior, people who have at one time gone to church but have stopped going for one reason or another. And what they found is that between 2000 and 2023, when they were working on the book, America had the biggest swing in church attendance practice in its history, with the crucial difference being that all the previous swings that we could look at where there was a condensed window of major changes in church attendance with people going from not churched to churched, what we've had in the last 20 almost 25 years is people going from churched to not churched. And so if you like using their study kind of project the numbers out, there's been about 40 million Americans that have stopped going to church in the last 25 years. And that's Catholics, it's mainline Protestants, and it's evangelicals. I don't remember the exact number for Catholics and mainline, but it was about 13 million evangelicals have stopped attending church in the last 25 years. So if you think about that, that's like the Southern Baptist Convention just stopped going to church, like the entire SBC, which is about 13 million people today. If the entire SBC stopped going to church in a 25-year window, that's the kind of change we're seeing now. So I think that's the baseline for talking about religion in the US, or Christianity at least in the US in 2024, is that we are probably at the tail end of a mass dechurching movement. But if you aren't reckoning with the dechurching movement, you're not really dealing with the state of Christianity in the US right now.
So let's pick up on that theme, the state of Christianity. What so many have said about the U.S., including those who visit the United States and those who are international business travelers is that it's fundamentally a nation that is a Christian believing faith, that other faiths are welcome, but that certainly the majority are practicing Christians of one denomination or another, that we celebrate the Christian holidays, the Christian calendar. And so the United States as a country and Christianity as a religion have been closely tied. As you're looking at these trends, do you still feel that that is a true statement, or has the de-churching movement, and you, as you put it, fundamentally altered the perspective of the United States to the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the thing that I think we can still say about the US, and to some extent you can even say this about the like broader Anglosphere in general, is that it's still a culture that's very deeply shaped by Christianity. It's very much downstream from Christendom. Tom Holland's book Dominion makes this argument. He's obviously a historian in the UK. There's a pastor friend of mine in the UK named Glenn Scrivener who has a book called The Air We Breathe that makes a similar kind of argument. And so I think you can certainly argue that a lot of the things that English speaking Westerners just kind of take for granted as they go about their days are downstream in some way from Christian belief or Christian community or culture, however you want to say it. So I think that piece is still true. Now, if you get into more kind of specific analysis of community behavior or individual behavior, broadly held beliefs about certain hot button issues, it gets a lot more complicated very quickly. So already, I think if you looked at the Northeast or the West Coast, which are major kind of cultural hubs and kind of the coastal regions are what non-Americans are most familiar with when they come over here, church attendance rates are very low in those parts of the country. Some places are higher than others. I think New York actually does better than like Seattle or San Francisco, for example. And parts of New England are much lower than New York, but it's low. If you get out into kind of what's called flyover country, which is where I am, it's not as robust as people might think based on what they believe or what they've heard about the US. Um, Certainly here in Nebraska, much of the state is very dechurched. And I think that's true. Actually, I just saw a study yesterday. I think it was Iowa has the number of churches in the state has shrunk by about 6% in the last 10 years, I think it was. It was something Ryan Burge had posted on Twitter, so people could check there. So, yes, it's Christian in the kind of Tom Holland Dominion, we live downstream from Christianity sense of the term, but in the sense of like, yes, Americans are people who go to church and they give money to religious institutions and they read their Bibles and they pray, not so much. And that's the trend that has been growing over the last 25 years. Is that helpful? I want to make sure I'm
Yeah,
following the question.
yeah, well, and so part of that question really goes to the nature of community and the nature of society, right? So we see certain trends and certain behaviors that seem to be closely linked to church. For example, people who celebrate common holidays that are tied to the Christian calendar. And that influences the days that businesses give people off. That influences the times of year that people tend to take, or businesses close altogether. It influences politics. It to some degree influences economics when people are focused on following a more traditional path towards marriage and kids and settling in a home, which is often tied to more of a religious faith idea of what family is. So if we make a theory that religion is sort of a foundational element of people's lives that they then base a lot of other decisions off of, and the sum of those decisions is sort of the society that we live in, has this separation of people from a church community started to impact all of those other downstream decisions about marriage and home buying and where they send their kids to school, and even businesses and how they think about their vacation calendars, all of those other things that stem from this common understanding and this common faith?
Yes, although I think it would be kind of a mixed bag depending on which issue you're looking at. So certainly there are fewer people getting married in the US today, It's fairly well known at this point that our birth rates have dropped off dramatically. Not so bad as like East Asia, but certainly in line with what you'd see in much of Europe. So if you're looking at those kind of family formation behaviors, yes, you can see significant change in behavior that does broadly correspond to the dechurching era. Although the fact that it corresponds, obviously, it's the classic correlations, not causation. So I wouldn't want to jump to that conclusion, but it is an interesting overlap at the very least. In other areas, I think it's more of a mixed bag. Like we still like public schools call it winter break now instead of Christmas vacation, but the 2 week winter holiday is still basically built around Christmas. Usually there's a day or two off around Easter. Like there's still a lot of those kind of things that are probably harder to change just because there's a certain inertia culturally about like changing holidays. Those things I think still hold up, but I'm also not sure how significant that is, especially when set next to something like family formation, which is a far bigger part of a nation's life.
So when we think about these trends of, we'll use the term dechurching. I like that because I think it's an easy one for people to follow anywhere they are in the world. Um, I think historically, when there has been a movement in the religious affiliations of a country or a large population, it's often been from one religious set of beliefs to another, from one religious community to another. Are we seeing any of that? That as people de-church from a Christian church, they are then re-churching with a non-Christian denomination, or is this a we're stepping away from a Christian church into no affiliation?
It's much more no affiliation. 50 years ago, if you left evangelicalism, you probably moved into the main line or in smaller numbers to Rome or maybe some other religious tradition. At this point, it's much more moving into being religiously unaffiliated. What's interesting about that, though, is religiously unaffiliated doesn't mean you become a materialist atheist who doesn't believe in any kind of supernatural. That's the line that people sometimes take and they assume, but it's not really true. Americans still have very widespread beliefs in all sorts of supernatural things. It's just a kind of intuitionist, unaffiliated thing rather than being something they're deriving from their sacred text or their religious community. So the stat, it was true in 2019 when I was writing my first book. I really hope it is still true because it would be a good, but at least 5 years ago it was true. There are more Americans who believe in ghosts than have used online dating, which when you put those two next to each other really messes with people. But I like looked that up while I was working on my book because I was trying to understand, are Americans just becoming materialists or are they just leaving organized religion? And the answer was much more clearly they're just kind of dropping out of organized religion and maybe becoming atheist. But even the kind of atheist they are, it's not the like, sorry for the traffic noise, it's not the Richard Dawkins new atheist, like I only believe in what can be measured kind of non-religion. It's just this kind of vague, amorphous, deinstitutionalized kind of set of beliefs that can vary wildly from one individual to another.
Now, what does that tell us about a community that may still hold the religious beliefs that they had in their youth? Maybe they still hold on to a lot of the traditions. They simply literally don't go to Sunday services. And maybe they are only loosely affiliated through donations or something. What does it tell us about the trajectory of the Christian faith in the US then, if the beliefs are still there, but the formal affiliation to a church is not?
So, the thing I would love to have some sociologists work on is I would love to see people putting the dechurching data that Ryan Burge has been developing in conversation with the work of Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at Notre Dame, who's done a lot of work on what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. And Smith's view that he was, and this was in the 90s when he first started saying this, was that a lot of church going Americans were not really Christian when you actually kind of poked at their beliefs a little bit. They were moralistic therapeutic deists. So they believed in a kind of vague God who wasn't really that involved in day-to-day life and who wanted them to be good people. And that was the belief. I think you could very easily make the argument. It all adds up in my head. I just haven't seen data to kind of substantiate it, that if you have that kind of moralistic therapeutic deism as the default in churches for a quarter century, dating back to when Christian Smith first started writing on it, there's not really a need to go to church in the moralistic therapeutic deist frame, because the only need is for you to be a good person, and what that means is really going to get defined on a individual basis for most people. I think there might be some basic kind of things we all agree on that you shouldn't do, but a lot of people, it's really going to be a kind of pursue your own truth kind of thing, is how a lot of folks will look at it. And when that's your frame, you don't have a reason to go to church. The other piece here that I think is really important is that there's a broader pattern in American life right now, just toward disaffiliating with institutions and public life more generally. So, philanthropic societies have fewer volunteers working for them these days. Things like bowling leagues are kind of a thing of the past. Like Bill Putnam, I think is his name, had a book called Bowling Alone that came out 25 years ago, talking about the breakdown of common life in the US. So, it may well be the case that a lot of the dechurching dynamics are not necessarily something going on unique to American religion or unique to the church, but it's just a broader part of this kind of trend of social disengagement or institutional disengagement that you can find all across American society.
So, what does the conversation look like in terms of trying to turn that around? I can say in all areas of society, at least in the United States, there's all kinds of ideas about how to get people more engaged in their communities. Churches used to be a pretty easy stepping stone into that for people who maybe didn't have a great starting point. You're moving from a new town, you're taking a new job somewhere, you don't know very many people. It doesn't feel like that stepping stone is being taken by as many people. But I also can't say I've heard any really good ideas about how to make church affiliation more interesting, more attractive, more relevant in people's life. What are you hearing from those who are in this space trying to think about this problem?
Yeah, I guess I I think we have to get more basic here in some sense in talking about church attendance, because the way that a lot of particularly evangelical Protestants have talked about it for the last 40 or so years is, well, look, church wasn't relevant. It didn't have kind of tailored content that made sense of an individual person's experience. But if we give them that, they'll come. And that worked for a minute, but the attractional movement, which kind of gave birth to that idea, I'm thinking of guys like Bill Hybels, Rick Warren, it's pretty dead at this point. I would argue it kind of died in the early 2010s, especially when Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Church in Seattle imploded. Because Driscoll was the one who would have carried on that attractional movement for the post baby boomer world, and then he crashed and burned hard in Seattle. So I don't think that movement is the answer. One of the things that's interesting in Burge's research and Mike and Jim's book is that the persistent pattern in dechurching is not actually, I saw corruption or abuse in my faith community and I left because of that. There's some of that. The single biggest behavioral predictor for dechurching, though, is simply moving. And after that, it was things like starting college, getting a first job after college, having a kid, things like that. So the thread here is I had this kind of weekly routine built around certain habits. Going to church was one of those habits. Then something happened in my life to disrupt my routines, and my habits got reset, and I never went back to church. So there's some sense in which people just find it very easy to kind of get through life without being part of Christian community. And so the thing that I'm interested in, and I've been interested in this, when I was just starting college, I spent 2 summers in a very intense Christian community called L'Abri, where there's some full-time members of the community who just live there and basically offer hospitality to anyone who shows up, and they don't fundraise. They pray and trust God to provide, and that has been the model they've run on since 1955. And so I spent 2 summers in a L'Abri community, and the thing that I found there was that actually people are longing for connection with other people, but that's really hard. They don't have very high hopes of finding it. And so it's easier to just disengage and step back and kind of construct the best life you can, the most comfortable life you can from whatever resources are available to you. But if you actually do provide genuine connection with people who care about you, it's transformative. There's a line Walker Percy has. I should just memorize it because I use it all the time. It's from the end of his novel, The Moviegoer, and something to the effect of, when a man becomes convinced that you really do care about his business, that the look that comes over his face is a sight to see. And so I think because we're human, I would say as a Christian, because we're made in the image of God, there's longings that we all have. And what I think a lot of people are doing right now is they are making the best they can out of life while basically trying to reconcile themselves to the fact that certain longings are just never going to be fulfilled, because families will fail you, your employer will treat you badly, your friends will move away. The best we can do is try to basically be comfortable and find a few things that give us pleasure. But if you actually can demonstrate to a person that you really do care about them, you really do want to know them, it's transformative. And there's just not a lot of that happens, I think, at least in the US right now. I don't know contexts outside the US as well. And so that's where I want to go. I want to ask the question, why is it so easy for people to drop church when their habits change? Because that suggests it wasn't a significant part of their life in the first place. So I actually kind of want to go back and poke at the experience they had of church before they ever de-churched and try to understand what that was like.
Are there parts of the country where that habit is harder to break? So, in other words, if you started in a part of the country in the US that religion is a huge part of daily life in the community and people know what church you go to, it's part of your biography, and you move to another part of the country where that's less so, is that person, in your view, less likely to break that habit just because of how important it was to their identity versus somebody who maybe grew up in a part of the country where you didn't even really talk about what church you went to. And so if you go to a new town and you don't go to any, you don't feel like it's changing anything materially about your biography.
That's a really good question. It'd be interesting to see if they had data on that in their study. My hunch is that that was probably more true 30 years ago than it is now. It's like my wife grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, which is like deep south, extreme red state. Yeah, like church on every corner kind of thing. And yet, if you look at even their church attendance data, like it skews older. And younger folks in cities like Birmingham or Nashville or Greenville, South Carolina, or Orlando, to go back to Mike and Jim, it's not as big a part of their life. And so, you might get the awkward question from a family member when you're around for holidays about where you're going to church, but that's probably about as far as it would go in most cases.
So, as we think about young people in particular, will, for the purposes of this, we'll say that these are folks who are high school age. Maybe they're in college. Maybe they're just recently graduated from school. What we hear is that this is a generation coming up that is less interested in religion than any prior generation. But I have heard anecdotally from others that, in fact, this is a generation that maybe doesn't have the same level of connection as others before it, and they're seeking it. And perhaps church communities can be resurrected by this generation as a way of solving their lack of community. What's your view on what to expect from this next generation? Are we going to continue the trend of less formal, organized religious engagement, or do you think we're going to at some point turn a corner and see more?
I think both are possible. A lot is going to depend on what the next 10 to 15 years look like. Because what we have right now is still some level of awareness of church attendance and church communities, some level of familiarity with Christian ideas. And I mean, even in the dechurching data that they had, one of the questions they asked people who have dechurched is, what would it take for you to go back? And a lot of people, it was as simple as being invited back, was all it would take to get them to return. So I think there's a possibility that there could be a resurgence. There's also a very good possibility that as you lose 40 million people, just speaking in kind of brass tacks terms, as you lose the money that 40 million people can provide, and this is not, I'm not talking about losing the money that pays for the pastor's mansion. I'm talking about losing the money that pays for the guy who does funerals and visits people in the hospital, or losing the money that pays for, maybe helps pay for the laundromat that the church has open for people in the neighborhood to use. When you lose those kind of resources and those staff positions, it gets harder to then engage with people. And so it could just become a kind of slow decline from here. I do think the thing that's interesting with the Zoomers compared to the millennials is that I think for the millennials, there was a sense of kind of, we were told what kind of sequence to follow to have a successful life. And a lot of us tried it and it just didn't work because finding a person to marry was much harder, or we took on tons of debt to go to college after every adult in our lives told us we had to go. And now you're burdened with a really hard economic position trying to service all that debt. So the millennials had a kind of track they were put on that just didn't work very well for a lot of them. Whereas for the Zoomers, it seems to be there's just not really a track at all. And you're just kind of sent out into the world to explore and make the best of it. And so I think there could be some opportunity there with Zoomers that isn't there for millennials, precisely because they're starting from a very different place. I think that the downsides to where they're coming from could be quite a bit worse than what the millennials have seen. But there's probably also a much higher ceiling for those folks than there are for millennials. Or that's kind of my like spitballing take. But I mean, it's based on some conversations I have and what I've read of different research. So yeah, it's possible. I think there's still, people are still kind of wrapping their heads around the fact that the country is changing so much, it's secularizing so quickly, and so there's still a kind of, maybe not the best metaphor to use, but fog of war phenomenon where people are kind of trying to figure out what's going on and what's coming next.
Now, let's pick up on that topic for just a moment of secularizing, because this is happening all over the world. But one of the interesting things about the United States is how large of a country it is. People, know 50 states, but no two are exactly alike. Vast regional differences, significant cultural differences from east to west, from north to south. Is that trend of secularization any more pronounced in any particular state or region than it is in others, or is it a broad scale process that's happening all throughout the U.S.?
That's a good question. So, church attendance has been lower on the on the Northeast and the West Coast for a long time. So the rest of the country had further to fall than those regions did. So there's a difference in that sense. There's also an interesting difference. One of the things Mike and Jim found in their data is that actually more people were kind of de-churching into a secular political right-wing ideology than into a left-wing ideology, which I think goes along with some of the de-churching patterns you're seeing in areas of the country that have traditionally been more churched. It was like they held on to their politics, but they didn't hold on to church attendance and probably didn't hold on to certain distinctly Christian ideas about a variety of issues. And so, yes, the shape of the secularism is probably going to be different from place to place. In blue states, you're going to see much more of a kind of Democrat Socialists of America, like what Wes Yang has called successor ideology kind of thing, I think. Whereas what I expect we're going to get more and more in red states or even just kind of red like congressional districts. Because like I live in Nebraska, which is a deep red state, but Lincoln is a very blue city. Actually, it's the state capital, it's the university, and it's a big tech hub. So when your economic drivers are government jobs, education jobs, and tech jobs, like that generally is going to skew one way politically. And so in Lincoln, it's very different from what you'd find in the rest of the state outside of Omaha. But what I think you could see is kind of the secular right. It's still early, but a friend of mine named Matt Walter did a column a few years ago for The Week where he coined the term barstool conservative. And it's a kind of libertarian, hedonist, individualist, right wing political ideology. He kind of located it around Dave Portnoy, who's the founder of Barstool Sports. This kind of, I think, pretty morally gross sports media guy, as kind of like the model of what Barstool conservatism is. And I think that's the kind of secularism you'll see emerging in a lot of red parts of the country. And so it is going to scramble a lot of people's categories in as much as I think you're going to start seeing more and more Christian ideas getting hit, not from the political left, but from the political right. And so Christian ideas about the duties we owe to foreigners, for example, will get attacked, but it will be from a very kind of nationalistic right wing sensibility, which will be a new thing. And I think will take folks a little adjusting to, because particularly like in the evangelical world, there's long been this idea that like the right is safe, center or left can be okay, but it's probably a little riskier, and you probably need to justify yourself being there in a way that a right winger doesn't. And that's going to change, and I think already is changing as we're going to start seeing more conflicts between the American right and Christianity.
Now, it's not uncommon around the world for religion and politics to blend into one, that your religious identity directly informs your politics. In the US, it's a newer, not new, but newer phenomenon. It wasn't always the case that you could predict somebody's politics by knowing what their faith was or whether they were a church attender or not. But we've also been hearing a lot in the last several election cycles that there is some sort of realignment, some sort of transformation happening within our politics, where some of what we thought was true about political alignment may not necessarily be going forward. So, do you subscribe to the view that in both left and right wing parties in the US, that there isn't a realignment that may be taking place, that whether it's this coming election in this November or in coming years and coming cycles, we may start seeing things in the voting patterns that surprise us based on both the trend of secularization and also those who remain religious but maybe don't feel as welcome politically as they once did?
Yes. So part of having a two-party system, as we do in the US, is that both parties will kind of reinvent themselves every 2 to 3 generations. So the example I've shared with people before is like my grandparents would probably be regarded as fundamentalists by most folks. They were lifelong Democrats because my grandpa was a railroad worker and they revered the Kennedys. Like they loved the Kennedys, they were for organized labor. And so my grandmother, who like loved Pat Robertson, gave money to Pat Robertson, called in and asked him to pray for me when I was slow to start speaking as a toddler, infant. She voted for Clinton in '92, and it's because she was a lifelong Democrat. So that's even indicative of the last realignment we had, which was probably in the '80s, and my grandma was in her '60s and just didn't keep up with it. So yeah, we're going through a realignment now. I think there has been a thought on the right that Christians could exert a strong influence over what the Republican realignment would look like. And I think this cycle is killing that belief just as we watch the evolution of the GOP on life issues as the biggest example. What I think the GOP is probably going to look like going forward is going to be very kind of techno optimist, Peter Thiel kind of thing. Malcolm Collins could be another one. He's a natalist type who's, again, I find him kind of creepy, but I think that's going to be where the American right is. It's going to be very hierarchical, very techy, very adjacent to a lot of transhumanist stuff via figures like Thiel and Elon Musk. And I don't know where the left is going to end up. The Democrats are not as far along in their realignment project as the Republicans are. Trump kind of sped run realignment for them over 2 cycles almost. This is kind of the end of the GOP realignment, I think. The Democrats have barely even begun. And I think what happens with them is going to depend a ton on what happens in November. Because if Harris wins in November, the argument is going to be that there's a certain kind of pragmatism. Like, there's a pollster, I think, named Shore, if I remember right, who's argued for something called popularism, which is that the Democrats can keep all their policies, they just need to emphasize the ones that are popular rather than the ones that are unpopular, and that's how they'll win. And I think there's a lot of ways in which this candidacy is, or this campaign is kind of a test of that thesis. And if that goes well, I think you'll continue to see them camp out on that. So they'll still be very much a center left party, but they're going to try to talk like centrists. And that's going to create one type of realignment. If Harris loses to a candidate as weak and compromised and self sabotaging as Trump, then you have a very different conversation about realignment. And I have no idea where that one ends because it kind of feels like all bets are off. Anything could happen, especially when you factor in that, like, there's a pretty deep bench of talented governors that all could represent slightly different versions of the party. You could have Bashir, you could have Shapiro. Like, if you had a primary in '28 that was Whitmer from Michigan, Bashir from Kentucky, Shapiro from Pennsylvania, and Gavin Newsom from California, that's 4 different visions of the Democrat Party right there. And I have no idea what one comes out of that as the winner. But yeah, we're going to see a realignment with both. Uh, my hunch is that a lot of traditional Christians in the US are just losers no matter what happens, because the GOP is going to be far less friendly to them. And the Democrats aren't really going to have any reason to want to bring them in, I don't think, because they're either going to win in '24 without them, or they're going to watch Trump win in '24 while alienating them as much as he can. Either way, there's not a strong incentive for them to think, wow, we really need to win over the like social conservative Christian voters, because I just don't know that there are that many.
So let's talk about one element of when we think of church attendance and church participation. What's relatively new post pandemic is the virtual community, the Zoom community, church by Zoom, we'll call it. And not that it wasn't a thing at all before, but it just wasn't a way most people practiced their faith or attempted to connect with others of a similar faith. Now, it seems to me this presents both risks and opportunities. The downside is an obvious one, that there's something to be said for the in-person community that comes with being in person every week, seeing the same people and connecting with them well beyond just what you're there for. But on the positive side, it also means you may be able to connect with people who don't live in your town, don't live in your state, don't even live in your country. And that might give you a more global view. Is there anything in your research or in the work that you've done that would indicate that this new era of digital church and digital interactions can help bridge from the past to some version of a future where organized religion looks different?
There are certainly people that want that to be true. I'm not one of them. I don't know of a ton of research yet on digital church kind of practices and attendance or things like that. If attendance is even the right word, viewership, I guess. The reason I'm pretty bearish about it is that I think the mistake that the attractional movement made over the last 40 years in the US is they really did transform what public worship was down to basically you sing some songs, you hear a talk, you sing some more songs, you go. So it reduced church to content, and it really deprived the people attending of any kind of active involvement in the service. So, like at the church I go to, we're a small Presbyterian congregation. Every week, as part of the service, we kneel collectively as a congregation and confess our sins. Every week, we stand up as a congregation collectively as the pastor. It's a theological thing, but the pastor doesn't absolve you in the Presbyterian tradition, but they would say that they give assurance that you're forgiven. And so the pastor will assure us that our sins are forgiven because of the work of Christ. So there's all these participatory elements to the liturgy at our church. And that's not the norm at a lot of churches. And what I think the digital move is it's basically more of the same. It's more church is really just content, and it's more church is really just something you passively consume. And I don't see if the problem is that church community has basically either not existed for people or it's been extremely disconnected from their sense of flourishing and health. I don't see how doubling down on those trends helps us. It seems more like you're just going to keep making it ever more minimal, ever less demanding, ever less serious in order to like prop up that number of attendees by saying, well, we had 300 people on the live stream this week.
One of the unique elements that I hear from our international listeners when they ask about things in the United States is our mega churches, as we call them. These large, almost arena size, in some cases they are arena size buildings with a single, usually very charismatic speaker who is preaching, and usually that is tied very closely to the Bible, but sometimes they use the Bible for a very small passage and then they go on and on and on about a whole bunch of other things. Now, I don't know actually how unique that is to just the US in terms of that format. I think plenty of other religions have a similar format, but they practice it a little different. Their traditions are a little different. um, do you see that as a particular version of expressing faith that is more popular, more likely to withstand because there is this sense of giant community, almost like a sports arena feel? Or do you think that's actually potentially moving in the opposite direction, and that's not what people want from their faith? Maybe some commentary from you on the idea of the megachurch, the American megachurch.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the first thing that's interesting is that the biggest megachurches in the world, if I recall correctly, are actually in Korea, not in the US. There's several absolutely massive churches in Seoul. And so the megachurch thing's not you it's not distinctly American. You can find it all over the world. And even something like Hillsong, which is one of the more successful kind of megachurch movements in the US, that's from Australia originally, not from the US. It came over here from Australia. So the megachurch thing is probably taken off much more in the US, but it's not. I would see it as more kind of a creature of a certain technological and economic moment, which existed outside of the US as well, more than I would anything distinctly American. As far as how they're going to weather dechurching trends, the things that work in their favor are that they have more money, and therefore they can do more kind of demographically tailored, targeted events for specific interest groups, if you want to talk about it that way. And so they might be able to hold on longer than the neighborhood church that has an underpaid pastor and a volunteer who plays the piano on Sunday morning. They might last longer than that church. I don't know that they're actually going to be more resilient in the dechurching era, though, because a lot of the really thin experience of community that broke when people's habits were reset and therefore is driving dechurching, a lot of that is coming from mega churches where you show up, you passively consume some content, you come in and out very easily without ever knowing anybody or ever meeting anybody because it's just so big. And it really takes a level of intentionality on the part of the church to counteract those effects of being so big. And I don't know that there's the will or the energy in a lot of churches to really try and resist those trends. I'd love to be wrong, but I don't think I'm. My pastor jokes that I always think I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right. So I don't think I'm wrong here, but I could be.
And what of the idea of the US just fundamentally changing demographically, ethnically, culturally, more people coming from around the world? As people are coming into the US, are you seeing that they're bringing their faith with them and practicing it in the US? Or is their act of moving also breaking their ties to whatever churches that they were part of in the nations that they came from?
So there's two layers to that. One of them is that the immigrant communities coming into the U.S. often for one reason or another, the community they land in looks a little different than the one they came from. It could be because they were Catholic in Central America and now they're involved in a Pentecostal church in the U.S. Or like we have some folks here, we have a Retrian community in Lincoln who are, I've been told, I have a friend who goes there, they mostly are attending the Greek Orthodox Church in town because there's not an Eritrean Orthodox or Ethiopian Orthodox, and the Greeks are the closest they get to a community like the one they have back home. So even for that first generation of immigrants, the attendance practices are going to shift a little bit. Usually, the pattern in American history has been within 2 to 3 generations, the immigrant community has been fairly assimilated. And so like I'm Greek and Swedish, and my ancestors that came over here were in Greek Orthodox and Swedish Lutheran churches. Most of us are still Christian, but almost none of us are in those churches anymore. So I'm in a kind of Presbyterian congregation. My parents are in a kind of non-denominational Bible church. You don't stay in the kind of ancestral faith tradition for very long in the US in most cases. I mean, even think about the thicker identities like Irish Catholics coming over or Italian Catholics. A lot of those folks just don't go to church anymore 2 or 3 generations later. So that's different. Another pattern that I'm worried about, and I don't know where this is going to end up, is that as the American birth rate continues to fall, and as the largest generation in American history enters mass retirement, we're going to have fewer workers and a much more burdened welfare system caring for our elderly. The way that you fix that as a country is you import workers to provide the tax base you need to support the welfare system. And so we're entering a moment in the US where the economic incentives are going to run toward pretty aggressive pro immigrant policies because we just need workers to finance our system. At the same time, one of the parties is increasingly defined by being deeply anti immigrant. And so I don't know if that creates policy problems where we don't get enough workers to shore up the system. Or the other question, or the other problem you could run into is immigrants come over here. And whereas, like, when my family came over 100 years ago, they felt like they could become American. And so they did. what if you come over here and then you hear your country talked about in really deplorable ways, and you don't feel welcomed and you feel threatened even at times by certain political movements? Do you start to conclude that we can't become American? And then what happens? So I think those kind of questions are going to become far more central to America's public life in the future. And where the dechurching angle comes in is that I actually think Christianity has a lot of very valuable resources for talking about those kind of issues. And I expect that Christianity is going to be almost totally marginalized in those conversations, which is going to make it worse. So that's my fear. Again, I'd like to be wrong. Uh, and we'll see what happens. A lot, obviously, will hang on what happens in November. But yeah, there's a lot of trend lines when you kind of zoom out from the dechurching conversation and you look at where our politics are. The trend lines worry me. And then you bring in also Christian resources aren't really going to be brought to bear to address these problems in a mass scale way. That combination of factors alarming to me, to say the least.
So, as we come to the end of the hour, I want to ask you about looking forward. What are some of the questions that you are looking to answer in your research and with your community about the trajectory of faith communities in the U.S. or, frankly, around the world? What questions are you asking that we should be asking?
Hmm. Well, so professionally, I run a media nonprofit called Mere Orthodoxy, and we describe ourselves as creating media for Christian and cultural renewal. So one of the kind of guiding questions we've had really since our beginning. We launched in 2005. I wasn't part of it back then. I came on later. But it's always been a question is how do we talk about the gospel in a way that actually sounds like good news to our neighbors? And I think the dechurching research highlights the fact that we haven't been doing that. There's been very much a kind of shrug in the face of Christian community and practice in America in a sense that it doesn't have anything to offer. So I would want to ask for Christians, why is that the response? What are we lacking in our practice, if anything, that's behind some of that? Well, personally, I don't know when this will air, but in the next couple weeks, we're going to be joining up with a new church that's starting our home denomination here in Lincoln. There's 3 churches right now in this communion, and we're going to be starting a 4th church here in the next few weeks. And it's actually going to be in the neighborhood I grew up in here in Lincoln. So we're probably going to be, well, we are going to be joining up with that. And I'm just going to be curious to see what happens with that church in its early years. Um, we have about 35 of us that are going to be meeting in a little elementary school in Northeast Lincoln, and we're going to wait and see what God does, I guess. I don't know what will happen with that. You could tell me that it's going to fail, and in 2 or 3 years, we'll be back at the church we're at now, and I wouldn't be completely shocked. You could also tell me that it's going to thrive, and in a few years, will be a self supporting congregation with several hundred people trying to buy a building, and I wouldn't be that shocked. I think the error bars, you might say, are really, really high right now in terms of trying to predict where we're going. And so there's scenarios that could be pretty bleak that I think are plausible, but there's also some, from my perspective as a Christian, as a Presbyterian, there's some scenarios that I also find really hopeful and encouraging to think about. And we're in a moment right now where we're still kind of trying to wait and see what emerges out of this moment, I think.
If people would like to learn more about you, your research, any of your past work, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, so I've written 2 books with InterVarsity Press that you can find on like bookshop.org or Amazon. They're called In Search of the Common Good is the first one, and What Are Christians For is the second. I've contributed to a handful of books as well, so if you search my name on Bookshop or Amazon, you'd find those. The main place I do my work is at Mere Orthodoxy, and all our work lives at mereorthodoxy.com. So any kind of device you use to access the web, you can find us. And we've got about 20 years of archives on the website. So there's lots to read if people are interested.
Excellent. We'll put links to that in the description of this podcast. Jake, thank you so much for taking so much time to speak with our audience today.
Thank you. It's been fun to be on.
We pride ourselves on the diversity of opinions and the diversity of individuals that we have on this program to share their research, their work, their experiences. And Jake certainly is the first of his kind to appear on our program because it's very difficult to talk about the topic of religion in an objective way, just based on research, just based on observation, not in any way, shape, or form promoting or demoting anybody's beliefs or anybody's faith. This was a conversation truly focused on what it means to be an active participant in a faith community in 2024. Now, as we wrap up this program, I just wanted to share two perspectives of mine on the topic and the questions that I still have going forward. So question number one, we touched on it in this episode about the intersection of faith and politics. It's my observation that this is always going to be an intersection worth studying in almost every society in the world where there is a large tradition and a long tradition of church and state having a symbiotic, even if separate, relationship. The fact is, if faith is a big part of your life, not just on the weekends and not just as a thing to do to build a community, but if you truly believe in the values of your religion, whatever that religion is, it is very hard to imagine that you can look at the world politically speaking when you get the opportunity to vote, or even if you're not in a country that has a free and democratic system, but you still have the opportunity to express political views through protest or through other forms. It's hard to imagine that religion would not be an animating force and that there won't always be elected officials and aspiring elected officials who tap into this natural urge that we all have to be part of a faith community and to continue a faith tradition to drive their own agendas. And this is going to be true among left-wing parties and right-wing parties, among centrist parties, among moderates. There's always going to be an appeal to those higher values that go beyond our day-to-day economic lives, that go beyond even the issues of the day in politics, that go to something deeper and more lasting. So as long as there are elected officials and leaders who are going to tap into that, and as long as it becomes such a central, critical part of people's lives that they look at everything in their life through the lens of their faith, which most practicing Christians and frankly most practicing religious people of any denominations do, I don't think we're going to see a significant separation of that. But there was a commentary in there that Jake said that I do think is worth exploring further, and I look forward to doing this maybe with those commentators on this program who are more politically inclined and perhaps less interested in the demographic views. And that is there the potential for a realignment? Is it possible that people who have had deep religious beliefs and have always voted in a certain way are open to changing that? And is it possible that some legacy parties in the world that have existed for a long time, or even those who are newer and align themselves with a certain faith community, all of a sudden could lose that or could grow that or could tap deeper into it? So that's one thing that I'm going to be looking at and looking at having more conversations around in the weeks and months to come. And perhaps the federal election in the United States in November will be an early indicator of whether there is any sort of realignment happening among Christians in the United States, which is the largest religious voting bloc, but maybe among other denominations as well. There's no reason to believe that the Christian community is going to be any significantly different in its voting habits in 2024 than it has been in the past, but there are some indications that there might be a different level of turnout. In other words, a different level of enthusiasm from that community. And if there is, that could change slightly what the vote count looks like for the Republican Party, let's say, versus the Democratic Party, and how many folks in the religious community just choose not to participate in this election. So, very interested in this intersection of politics, religion, and voting patterns. The other thing that is really fascinating to me is the sense of community, because this is a trend around the world that we hear constantly, the crisis of loneliness. individuals, often young, who have no real community. Now, this is something that churches often filled in the past. That if nothing else, if you were born into a family that had a faith tradition, you were likely to be embraced by that community, by that church. And you'd go through the tradition of, becoming an adult through those religious sacraments or those religious traditions and celebrations. There's less of that today than there has been in the past in much of the industrialized world. And we've also seen some indications that even in very religious societies around the world, in India and the Middle East, that even in these places where religion is deeply ingrained in daily life, there is some separation between those traditions, those let's call them family traditions that have incorporated religion in the past, but they were celebrated within the faith community, and now those that are less celebrated by the faith community and more exclusive to just the family unit. I know it's a little confusing to say, but you have to think about how community has come about throughout much of the world, and it wasn't necessarily just at the neighborhood level, the family level. It was celebrated in the church, in the synagogue, in the temple. You'd be doing these things together, and the entire community would welcome, a new baby, would celebrate your marriage, would celebrate some great achievement from a member of their community. There isn't as much of that today as there has been in the past. So the intersection of the lonely individual and the general decline in active faith community participation, these two things must be related. But it's not like the church community is the only institution of community that has faded over time. Jake mentioned it in this interview that there's been a general decline of institutions around the world. Churches are institutions. Any other way we want to look at them, they are a symbol of a tradition, of a past, and of linking our heritage to our present day. And there's been a general rejection of these authoritative figures, these authoritative bodies as they have been seen by younger generations. But interestingly, it's not been a rejection of community and religion and government in favor of an alternative. It's just been rejection and a turn towards individualism. Where that takes us is a fascinating topic unto itself and one worth exploring further. What I can say is it's fascinating to me as we do this show. We look at all the trends around the world. We think about where that's taking us. We've never really had an international order where religion was not a major motivating, organizing principle. Whether it's Christian-leaning nations, Islamic-leaning nations, a country like India that celebrates sort of a national faith with the Hindu religion, and plenty of other religious groups that are smaller. And, even within Christianity, there's, of course, a Protestant branch and a Catholic branch, and some countries are leaning more in one direction and some in the other. For those who are familiar with the United States, you know the difference between a Southern Baptist, per se, and Lutherans in the northern part of the country. But what if we have a society where less and less of our organization is based on religious motivations? What if we start to lose that commonality where no matter who you are and where you land in the political structure, there is some debate about what our overall moral and ethical code demands of us? Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Because we've seen religion and religious differences spark conflicts, but we've also seen it be the motivator for very great acts of kindness and charity and generosity. We don't know. I don't have an answer to it, but I'm fascinated to explore it, and I hope that you'll stick with me on this program as we explore questions like this and others, where we build this community of curious minds that asks questions like this, and we're always seeking important and credible guests and experts to help guide us through all of these points. Thank you all again for listening to this program. I invite you to subscribe. If you are not already a subscriber, you can get access to this program anywhere, absolutely anywhere that you get your podcasts. And we are available on YouTube as well. If you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so. We post full episodes there, so you can subscribe and always be the first to see them. But you can also get exclusive clips, just preview clips like this one, where you'll be able to share with family and friends who are less familiar with the show. Give them a 5 or 10 minute soundbite, see if they like the program, then they can come, subscribe for themselves, and listen to full episodes. You can also visit me on my website, brianjmatos.com. Follow me on any of your favorite social media channels. And if you have any specific questions for me, you can always reach out to me on my social channels or via email, Brian, B-R-I-A-N, at brianjmatos.com. As always, thank you very much for listening. This is Brian J. Matos, encouraging you all to remain and stay curious.